Alex Abella is the Cuban-born author of the book, Soldiers of Reason, the Rand Corporation, and the Rise of the American Empire. He was allowed exclusive access in the Rand Corporation archives. What he found was mad scientists, behaviorists, and hawkish generals who were intent on starting World War III and fleecing the American people on the way. Once he was a skeptic of the subject of conspiracy theories in the New World Order, but after his work with the Rand Corporation, he is now convinced that this top-secret think tank has been pulling the strings of American government for at least 60 years.
Hi, I'm Alex Abella. I'm the author of Soldiers of Reason, the Rand Corporation, and the Rise of the American Empire. This was a book that came out in 2008, and it basically is a history of the Rand Corporation and its influence on American history and basically, I guess, world history. In a way, what I say in the book is that we're all the bastard children of Rand, and we don't even know it. Originally, the Rand Corporation was an offshoot of the Air Force, which wanted to recreate the Manhattan Project. As you recall, the Manhattan Project was when civilians and the military got together to create the atomic bomb. After World War II ended, a general named General Henry Arnold wanted to make sure that that same combination of civilian scientists and military know-how got together so as to be able to create new weapons. They went on then to develop this particular organization, which is to be called eventually RAND, which stands for Research and Development. Now, RAND originally was supposed to be only to go into the theoretical things, sort of like developing plans for intercontinental ballistic missiles, and to develop new weapons of destruction. Ultimately, it expanded into other fields. It expanded into social science, it expanded into history, it expanded above all into economics. And it got to be so big that the Air Force had to spin it off. They had sited it over at Douglas Aircraft, which was one of the biggest aircraft manufacturers in the country at the time. So in 1948, they spun it off. Now, the reason why I'm talking about all this is because from the beginning of RAND as a separate entity apart from the Air Force, that is, as its own corporation, when it becomes the RAND Corporation, it's been intrinsically linked to the Ford Foundation. If we're talking about the robber barons, if we're talking about people like Carnegie, about Ford, Rockefeller, well, yes, I mean, there has been always a link between think tanks and the big, powerful economic interests. Specifically, in the case of RAND, there has been a link between RAND and the Ford Foundation. In fact, the attorney who drafted the Articles of Incorporation for RAND was the same fellow who later became the president, the first president of the Ford Foundation. And they used to go around asking the people at RAND, are there any particular projects that you want us to fund? Without Ford money, the RAND Corporation would have never gotten off the ground. So from the beginning, there has been that, that intricate, that, you might say that really intimate relationship between the two bodies, between the two ways of looking at the world. Because after all, what you have here with the big economic interests is that they want to make sure that their own interests are protected. They want to make sure their goods can be sold throughout the world. And they want to make sure that we have consumers for that. And RAND, in a way, served as a very useful adjunct to that particular way of thinking. The original title for my book was the Rand Corporation and the New World Order. I did that on purpose, and I wanted to have people think about what those words actually meant. Because what Rand actually did during the 1950s is that they came up with this particular way of looking at the world that changed everything, that changed the world we live in, that changed how we think, how we talk, the schools we send our kids to, how we pay our taxes, the planes we fly in. They've changed the whole world. And that's what I'm saying, in a way, that we are the bastard children of Rand. And what do I mean by all that? They began the whole process of giving an ideological foundation to the process of deregulation that would come to a head during the Reagan administration. They developed something called rational choice theory that, after it came up and after it was developed and expanded, It turned us from citizens into consumers. And instead of having rights and responsibilities, we became consumers with choices. In a world where what really counts is what they call the consumer sovereignty, or the sovereignty of the consumer, where what counts is not what we do, or who we believe in, or what God we pray to, but how much money we're going to spend, and what's in it for me. In a way, it changed the whole physiognomy of America, and by extension, the rest of the world. Obviously, my book deals mostly with the Rand Corporation, and the Ford Foundation is sort of like an offshoot of the whole thing. But I do know that at the time that the Rand Corporation was founded, like I said, the first president of the Ford Foundation was one of the founders of the Rand Corporation. And their goals are very similar. Their goals were to have a world in which you have technocrats running everything. One of the founders of Rand, one of the main intellectual luminaries of Rand, was a fellow named John Williams, who was the head of the mathematics department. And he believed in preemptive nuclear attacks in the Soviet Union, and he believed in bringing about a one-world government that would be run by technocrats like himself, by people who would be following what he called the rule of reason, which would be all right if only that reason was controlled by ethics. Unfortunately, neither in the world of Rand nor in the world of that Ford Foundation at the time was there much call for an ethical point of view of what our life is supposed to be all about. Instead, it was going to be a world in which efficiency was all, in which men almost became substitute machines. And if you look at the early history of Rand, matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why they went into the social sciences, because they couldn't figure out how to deal with people. People are messy. People are not rational at bottom. But the people at Rand and the people at the Ford Corporation thought that humans are rational and that what guides our actions is self-interest. Of course, you and I both know that's not the case. We love our children. We love our family. We love our country. Sometimes we are even willing to give our life for a fellow human being, even though we may not know him. Now, all those principles are denied by the doctrines of rational choice theory that came out of Rand. There's no place for that in the worldview of both the Ford Foundation and the Rand Corporation at that time, in the early 50s. Humans are messy. Humans are complicated. Humans are both rational and irrational. I believe at bottom we're all irrational, and that we use rationality as a tool to achieve ends that in and of themselves are not rational. Rational choice began as a way of countering Marxist doctrine. You may not recall this, but at the end of the Second World War, during the late 40s, early 50s, there was a great deal of pessimism in the Western world. People really thought that capitalism was going to die, basically, that communists were going to win, and that there was no way to stop the dialectical progress of humanity, so to speak, to borrow some of the terminology of the communists, that there was a certain way that history developed, and that all that we could do was, bend our heads and say, okay, Lord, here we go. That was not the case, obviously. But the United States had to come up with a theory that would legitimize the individualist perspective on life that the United States has always had and that Western civilization had. So there was an economist named Kenneth Arrow that was hired by the Rand Corporation to come up with what they called the utility function for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a very closed society. We had some spies. We didn't have that much information about it. Basically, Rand, as the think tank for the government, was given the task of trying to decide how would the Soviet leaders act. In other words, what would Joseph Stalin do if, let's say, we were to invade Poland, or if we were to go into the Soviet section of Germany? How would they react? So therefore, they gave him this particular assignment, which was to assign what they call a utility function. How would the leaders of the Soviet Union react given a particular crisis with the Western world? So what Arrow did is that he took it from a perspective of a mathematician, and he assigned certain values to his research. And he came up with this theory called rational choice theory, whereby he postulated that it's self-interest what drives people, that humans are essentially rational, that all humans think with the same kind of rationality, that science is universal, and that we're all in it for ourselves, and that there's no such thing as religion, altruism, patriotism, that self-interest rules all, and that therefore what we should have is something called the sovereignty of the consumer, that we should give people as many choices as they can, because according to his theory, if you have a group of 4 people and there's more than 2 choices, there's never going to be a democratic decision, because one of the parties is going to impose his will on the others. Now, I know to us that sounds like nonsense, because obviously we live in a democracy, or what comes as close as we can to being in one, and we do believe in majority rule, but according to these axiomatic principles that Mr. Arrow developed, there is no such thing, that there's always the tyranny of a particular party over another. So therefore, in order to countervail that, and thus to countervail Marx's doctrine, he came up then with the theory of rational choice. Rational choice then became the foundation for all the deregulation that happened during the Ronald Reagan era, and even before, during Carter. Because after all, if people are only in things for themselves, then there's no such thing as a politician acting for the good of the country. So therefore, it's all self-interest. So therefore, we have to do things in such a way that everybody will get the most benefit out of it. Therefore, we have to deregulate things, because we have to see what do we get out of this, and it would be unnatural to expect people to actually give things to others, because after all, that's not what human nature is all about. So that became the foundation, for deregulating industries and for basically the mess that we find ourselves in. Rand obviously didn't just develop rational choice. I mean, obviously Rand was created to create new weapons of mass destruction, so to speak. So they were extremely instrumental in the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. They were also extremely instrumental in the creation of the hydrogen bomb as well. And as the 50s went on, they were involved with NASA. Matter of fact, they were one of the first people to propose an orbiting Earth station, an orbiting satellite station around the Earth. And that was like the first project that they did back in 1946. They were also involved, very heavily involved, in the use of nuclear weapons. Why is that? Well, Rand was the creation of the Air Force. The Air Force at the time was the golden child of the military services in the United States, because they were entrusted with the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb, and later the hydrogen bomb, because they were transported by airplanes. Intercontinental ballistic missiles had not been developed yet. So therefore, Rand was involved in this brand new form of looking at warfare. One of the first things that Rand tried to do was to come up with a theory of general warfare, a theory of how warfare should be applied, what should be done, and of course, it didn't work, because there's no such thing as a general theory of warfare. There might be something like that in physics, but certainly not in war. So therefore, that went by the wayside. So therefore, what Rand began to do is to do special localized studies. And one of the things that they did was called the basing study, which highlighted how the United States would have been susceptible to a sneak Soviet attack that would have destroyed our country, basically. Would have destroyed not only our planes sighted in Europe with all the nuclear weapons, but they would have been able to come in under the radar, and just like the Japanese did in Pearl Harbor, they would have been able to attack the United States. Because of studies that were done out of Rand, especially by one of his foremost researchers, a guy named Albert Wohlstetter, the United States Air Force changed the way in which its nuclear airplanes were sighted, and in which the bases were done. And therefore, it changed the way in which nuclear bombs and nuclear weaponry were handled. Not only that, they also developed a whole theory of how to utilize atomic weaponry. You have to realize that the atomic weapon, the first A-bomb, is dropped in Nagasaki in 1945, but nobody really knew what to do with it. I mean, when they dropped the first bomb in New Mexico, in Alamogordo, nobody really knew what was going to happen with that bomb. Some scientists took bets as to whether the whole world would go up in flames. They didn't know what was going to happen, whether a chain reaction would begin and the whole Earth would be destroyed. Obviously, it wasn't. But once that weapon was developed, then they had to come up with a way of using that weapon, because after all, its power was immense. We used it twice in Japan, but would we use it again? And if we used it again, what would happen? RAND, because it was basically the only think tank that was in charge of thinking about those things, came up with the whole theory of how to use these weapons. Basically, then, it came up with the whole theory of second strike capability, which is that it really doesn't matter what the other side does to you. What matters is how bad can you injure them after you have been attacked yourself. In other words, if you're able to survive the attack by your enemy and you're able to counterattack, that's what really counts. And thus, a whole new nuclear strategy came about, and that's because of RAND. RAND was also instrumental in developing airplanes that were able to refuel the bombers that would take off from the United States to bomb the different targets in the Soviet Union. And again, that came about because of the Beijing study, because after the Beijing study, all the planes that had been sighted in Europe were moved back to the United States, and then they had to develop a way of being able to refuel these planes in midair, and thus they came up with the whole idea of refueling in midair with having another plane bringing in the fuel and doing it like that. So that's the other thing that that RAND was involved in. Other people that came out of RAND also changed what had been, I don't know, I mean, really a lunatic way of looking at the world, because basically they had the United States government had a plan that said, we have a problem with the Soviet Union because we don't have enough soldiers in Western Europe. We're just going to drop a bomb on them. And we're not just going to drop one bomb, mind you, we're going to blast them all out of existence. It was called the SIOP, the plan for basically blasting the Soviet Union to smithereens, not only the Soviet Union, but the entire Eastern Europe, the entire Warsaw Pact alliance, and China, for good measure. So there was a scientist that came out of RAND. His name was Daniel Ellsberg, who later on became very famous because of the Pentagon Papers. And he was the one that was able to pressure Robert McNamara and the Kennedy administration into changing that operating plan, and to make sure that if there was a problem in Western Europe, that we wouldn't just be going around and actually trying to wipe out the Soviet Union. The problem was that, and there's so much to talk about, because after all, the RAND Corporation also had come up with these plans and these what-if scenarios that said basically, we can survive a nuclear war. And that's what they did in the 1950s. And that's why they were so closely tied into the development of what President Eisenhower later called the military-industrial complex. Researchers at RAND really believed that as long as 10 million of us survived the nuclear war, that we had won. Even if 90 million of us died, it doesn't matter, because the other 10 million would be able to survive, would be able to come up and, come out of their caves and the mine shafts and everywhere where they were taking shelter, and they would be able to recreate the world. Of course, President Eisenhower, when he was presented with these plans, said that's total nonsense. As he said, there wouldn't be enough shovels to be able to scrape away all the dead that we'd have all over the country. But these people who were allied with the RAND Corporation and with industrialists who actually stood to make a lot of money out of developing these new weapons of destruction kept pressuring President Eisenhower into increasing the Pentagon budget. But Eisenhower cut it back. So instead, what they did is that they went around and they picked someone who they knew would be much more malleable and who, in fact, would increase the Pentagon budget by a dozenfold. And his name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was, in a way, a creature of the military-industrial complex. one of the reasons why Kennedy came into the White House is he was going around saying, well, we have a missile gap. The Soviet Union has so many more missiles than we do. Well, it was nonsense. None of that existed. Actually, the missile gap was in our favor, which is something that Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had to admit within the first few months after he took office, which is, you know, what we thought was there was not there. And how did that information come about? It came out of scientists at RAND, who, whether deliberately or not, fed that information to the Kennedy camp, so Kennedy would be able to go around and say, the Russians are going to beat us. The Russians are going to have our lunch. The Russians are going to destroy us. There's a missile gap, and they're going to wipe us out, which of course was not the case. So it's a long and complicated relationship between the RAND Corporation and the military-industrial complex. RAND researchers to this day look down on the CIA. They think they're amateurs. They think they're fumblers. They think they don't know what they're doing. They think that just by going around and playing that spy versus spy, that, you know, they'll be able to get control of the world. These guys know better. What you have in the RAND Corporation is the cult of reason. The belief that reason can solve all problems. That there is nothing that reason cannot mend or cure or improve. I don't think that's the case, and I think most of you probably don't think that either. But that's what they believed. So therefore they think that the CIA is a whole bunch of fumblers, of people who are amateurs who don't know what they're doing. So from the beginning, it's true that they cooperated with the CIA, and they did research that later on was utilized by the CIA. A very famous example of that was the Viet Cong study that was done in the 1960s, a Viet Cong morale study that was commissioned by President Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara as to what motivated the Viet Cong, which is the Forces of National Liberation in South Vietnam. You know, they gave this report to the federal government, to McNamara and to Johnson, and they said these guys are not motivated by reason. These guys are there because they're patriots, because they want to have a better country, because they really believe that they're being taken advantage of by the colonial powers, and they see the United States as a colonial power, and they're willing to die for their cause. Nobody listened to that. RAND was also involved in a number of studies in counterinsurgency as well. Matter of fact, they probably hosted the first conference on counterinsurgency back in the 1950s. And they were even advocating military coups in third world countries, thinking that, again, if you have a small group of military who have been trained, hopefully in the United States, if not there, then in Europe, but people who believe in reason, again, who believe in technological advancement, who believe that people can be improved and that things can be ameliorated by the use of reason and by the use of, you know, American resources, that it was better to have the military go in and stage coups and therefore lift all these countries out of the quagmire of poverty and ignorance that they found themselves in. And they hosted a number of conferences like that, in a way almost instigating these military to stage coups, which, by the way, happened later. Happened in Peru, happened in Chile, happened in Brazil. Obviously, they were not directly involved. They weren't there distributing the weapons to all these people, but they were certainly the intellectual parents of what happened. I do believe that the national security apparatus that was established after the Second World War served as an excuse to extend the power of the federal government. Now, you have to realize, though, when you look at it from a historical point of view, that there's always been two countervailing tendencies within the United States, right from the time of the Founding Fathers, in that you had Hamilton and Jefferson on the other side, with, you know, Jefferson advocating federalism, with the power being given to local communities, to gentlemen farmers, to decentralize authority, and Hamilton, on the other hand, advocating a strong central government, very much on the European model, and with Washington, most of the time, falling into Hamilton's camp. So you have this constant back and forth between the Federalists and the, lack of a better word, the centralists, you know. And it went back and forth up until the Second World War, when, because of the menace that was the Axis powers and the way in which we defeated them by expanding the power of the federal government, and later on, because of the menace posed as well by the Soviet Union, or at least the perceived threat of the Soviet Union, also expanded the power of the federal government. And in a way, as many others have said, it just became an excuse to expand further and further the influence of the federal government in everyday affairs. And that's a fact. There's no denying that. Rand was not directly involved in the setting up of the United Nations. However, there were people who were involved in the setting up of the United Nations who then went to work at Rand. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Rand is not necessarily what Rand does as an institution, but what the people who work within Rand do, and their influence within Rand and later on in the world at large. I mean, I guess the most recent example of that would be Donald Rumsfeld, who, you know, was chairman of the board of Rand before he became Secretary of Defense under President George Bush. As regards the UN, you have to realize that a lot of the people that founded Rand were actively advocating a one world government, and they did believe that the United Nations served as sort of like a template for that. But actually, they thought that there should be another organization that would actually supersede the United Nations, an organization that would be directly controlled by the United States and that would serve as a world government. And that's why some of the leaders, the early leaders of Rand, such as John Williams, advocated preemptive nuclear strikes on the Soviet Union to make sure that the United States would be the only country in the world that had the supreme power, which is to say nuclear weapons, to be able to impose its will on the rest of the world. False flag attacks, obviously, are when one country comes up with a pretext for attacking another country. In the United States, the most famous example of that is the Gulf of Tonkin and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, when President Johnson knew or suspected or should have known that the information that he was receiving about an attack by the North Vietnamese was totally false. But yet he used that to be able to go to Congress and then to approve a resolution authorizing the deployment of American troops in Southeast Asia. There's also the Northwoods report or incident, which is a proposal by the Pentagon to, again, use false flags to provoke the United States into invading Cuba in 1962. Of course, that came out, that was supposed to be